What we're going to do now is the wonderful session on a historian on your team. This is our conversation with potential employers. So would you please come up here, those of you who are on this panel. What do you last? Okay. Okay. Let's get another couple chairs here. Historians do everything. There we go. And we need one more? Yes, here's one. Are we good? One more, because I got to show that. Because I'm going to talk to you, but not much. Less than usual. Oh, who knows? Okay, so what I'm going to do is ask all of our panelists to just briefly introduce themselves and tell you who they are and where they're from, and then I'll start asking questions, if that's okay with all of you. Sorry for the ad hoc nature of everything. And Jim, can we start with you?
Sure. I'm Jim Walther. I'm the director of the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History, which is located here in Albuquerque.
I'm Sarah Wentzel-Fisher. I'm the editor of Edible Magazine, and I also work for the National Museum.
I'm Bob Donia. We're loosely affiliated with the University of Michigan, and also doing some consulting work in various aspects in writing and research in history.
I'm Emily Greenwald, and I'm one of the owners of Historical Research Associates. I just want to make it clear I'm not one of the founders, but I am one of the current owners of HRA, History and Cultural Resources Management consulting firm that is based in Missoula, Montana, which is where I am and has offices and locations.
I'm Rebecca Ullrich. I'm the corporate historian at Sandia National Labs, which is the local nuclear weapons lab here in town, down on Kirtland Air Force Base.
Actually, that's one of my favorite things I ever heard. It's our local nuclear weapons.
Well, there's two.
You have to specify it in New Mexico, right? That tells us a lot about who we are and what we do.
We have sites.
So all of you have studied history in one way or another, have expertise in history, have practiced history at some time. You're doing that and other things in some cases, lots of other things. And so my first question to all of you is, what kind of skills do you seek when you're trying to put a working group together? What are you looking for? And we can start with anybody. You want to go ahead?
Sure. Well, let's see. The museum industry is a big one. There's 17,500 museums in the United States, and that's probably a small number in comparison to what really is out there, and almost a half of them employ historians in one way or another. So putting together a working group that our museum would have, we have a curator who is a trained historian with a degree, a master's in history, and we would look for research skills, flexibility in the way in which they think, writing skills, certainly a sense of how the discussion around history would take place, because we're reaching out to the American public, and we must write at, unfortunately, the 9th grade level, which is where most people read. And so bringing the excitement and making the connections of history to the modern time and connecting to what people know today with what they don't know about the past takes some real interesting, some work. And so we would look for someone who has those sort of skills. And let me just check, make sure I didn't have one other. Executive process. Now that is sort of the ability to link the ideas that might come about in a working team. Museums often do development of programming, exhibitions, in team approach, where they have designers and educators and curators, historians, Sometimes there's a budget person involved. Make sure that you don't overspend. You know, just keeping all of that together with the executive process of the way the thoughts flow is really important. Obviously, museums often employ collections, objects of historical value. Our museum, which is the congressionally designated museum for the country for nuclear science, one of 7 national museums not in D.C., but the only national museum that's private. It's not run by the government any longer. We have 24,000 objects, and the curator is in charge of all of those. Has to know where they are all the time. Pretty tough. So somebody who has a sense of that. And then last, probably what I'd be looking for is someone who's a good collaborator. Someone who doesn't have a big ego, or to imagine not. Somebody who's open to working in a team and enjoys the interplay of ideas and doesn't have difficulty with that.
Sarah, how about you?
For me, I guess I would reiterate a lot of those things. As somebody who's putting together a popular culture magazine, I look for somebody who is a good writer, who can handle research, who can take complicated ideas and think critically about them, but then transform them into language that is digestible and entertaining to an audience. Collaboration is huge. And then, you know, because we are a popular magazine, 2 other things that I think about are sort of the marketability of those ideas. How do we take them and use them in a way where we can, in the case of my magazine, we are selling the idea of localization of our food system. How do I take research and those ideas and make them help me sell that particular idea? And how do I leverage them in a number of different formats and ways? And so I like people who can think creatively about, how do I take this story about apples and turn it into an event, turn it into a blog post, turn it into an article, turn it into a tasting? How do I really leverage it for many different purposes? So I think that that's what I would add to those previous ideas.
I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but I want to hear from everybody else, because I want to just flag the idea of selling ideas, which I think, you know, that, Bob gave an incredible keynote speech yesterday, and it was a master class on how to give a public talk. And the idea that, you know, you were talking about teaching and sales being similar. The idea of selling ideas sort of encapsulates those things in one place. So maybe that's, maybe I'm teeing you up here, I don't know.
Well, I'll position this imaginary working group in the International Institute at the University of Michigan. First thing I would look for is plays well with others. A good collaborator, essentially, somebody who's going to be very lively, have a lot of ideas, but not hog the floor, and not be divisive. Second, I would emphasize diversity. Try to bring together maybe somebody from the humanities, at least one person from one of the professional schools, law, business, and probably a donor, if I could find one. That's always a nice thing to include in any working group, if you could get a donor who's willing to devote time to it.
Can we stop just a minute and ask if there are any out there? Any donors in the room? We got, I thought I'd ask.
Reminds me of the country pastor who was visited by the IRS agent, and the IRS agent says, your parishioner, Mr. Jones, is it true that he devoted $5,000 to the church last year? The pastor says, oh, he will. There's a lot of different ways. And then I'd include a student.
The teams that I work with on are a group of historians from within our company, and the things that I look for in my teammates are similar to what everybody else is saying, but in particular, an inquisitive mind. I want somebody who I can turn loose in the archives, who will follow things around, be informed by what they're seeing in one set of records, and think about, well, what else does this mean, and where will I find the records that this suggests should be out there. So I want them to be inquisitive and engaged with the questions we're working with, but also have the ability to focus and understand the parameters of what we're doing, and that we can't go off in every which way. We have to still serve the client. Good communication is essential, and an ability to troubleshoot and alert me as the project manager to problems that are arising when they're arising instead of down the road, because if something comes up that's going to affect our ability to complete the project on time or on budget, I need to know about that as early in the process as possible. I think we talked yesterday some about people who can take criticism well, who can take direction well, but can also speak up and offer suggestions, are engaged enough in the process that they're not just taking orders and going off, but are really working with you to define the tasks. But also, when you say, no, we're not going to do it that way, they say, okay, accept the direction from the top. I like people who will ask for help rather than just trying to tough it out on their own and figure out everything for themselves, because that takes more time and sometimes leads to the wrong answer to the problem. I'd rather hear the question and be able to point the teammate in the right direction.
So on top of the collaborative skills that have been mentioned, and historical research and writing, which I assume if we're bringing in a historian, that's what we want you. I need that writing to be, you need to write well, and as we learned yesterday, none of us do, so take criticism and let it go several rounds. But I also need people who can write efficiently. Okay, I can't wait a week to get a paragraph, and it has to come out, and I need you to be able to own it and sell it. And by that I mean I need you to be able to dive into whatever the research, whatever the problem is, identify it, go find whatever, and come back and be able to speak confidently to it or write confidently to it, to the point where you know where your confidence ends. Okay, that we're all clear on where what you actually know and what you found and what you're solid on and where the gaps are, so that we So we know before it hits a presentation or an exhibit or a lab news article or the public presentation where we don't know things, okay? Because we keep our embarrassment internal in general, as most organizations do. And I also need, as was mentioned earlier, the ability to reuse it, right? We need to be able to slice and dice what we know into several different settings. So, it might be a paper, or it might be an exhibit, it might be investigation for research for cultural resources management, and a big part of what I do is support cultural resources management in Sandia, so occasionally we're bringing on consultants and contractors to help support that. So there's that kind of writing, which is form filling out and report writing, and then there's being able to take that information and turn it into an interesting blog post, an interesting exhibit, an interesting topic, whatever, that kind of thing. So to be able to not just reuse the information, but also to write for different audiences, and keep that in mind. Sometimes I'm bringing on people, specifically people with, if I need support on a cultural resources management project, I'm not going to take somebody who has no experience in that arena, because I don't have time for that. So, so we might be hiring specifically to that. I tend to look for people when we're bringing on, particularly grad students, who are at least interested in history of science, history of tech. I am myself a historian of science. It is an engineering lab. That's what we're going to be talking about. I need you not to go white-faced and blank when somebody starts talking about plasma physics or whatever. You don't have to be able to do plasma physics. You have people who do that. But people who can at least hum those parts, right? Okay? And that's important. And to be able to follow it and be able to describe it. Not the way a tech writer would in terms of reflecting it back as the technical piece, but to be able to understand where it fits in the story. And so, so you end up sometimes off into some kind of specialty areas. And you have to be comfortable with the science and technical world. in that sense, because those are the people you're gonna be talking to, right? And you can come talk to me, but really there's just me, and then there's all those engineers. And I also need people who can, in general, deal with a variety of different topics quickly in a single day, right? 10 different research topics coming and going, like where are we at on all of that? And then that sort of varies depending on what the assignments are. And then I would just say specifically, because of the nature of the work that it is, and because of the particular institution, I need you to be able to get and maintain a clearance, security clearance. Okay? So if you've been shopping in Colorado, it may not be your place of your employer. Okay? That's all I'm saying. And that's just a reality. And I would echo, yesterday afternoon there was some discussion about just the political nature of what you choose to write about, and the political, silence is politics, supporting the status quo is a political decision. If you are inside that lab and working for that lab, you are supporting that lab. And you may or may not agree with the overall politics of that lab, the policy that is the reason that that lab exists. Nuclear weapons are what we're talking about here. You don't have to be politically on the spectrum anywhere in particular, but you have to realize that you're not going to start the revolution from within over there, okay? And so you have to at least realize that, as Dr. Blunt said yesterday about the NORAD work, the most of the goal, we have internal goals for history in which we're talking to our internal audience. We also have, the history program also has a burden of intersecting with the broader historical community. And like Lance at NORAD, I'm basically trying to throw stuff over the fence so that somebody else will write. It'll be part of the definitive histories of the Cold War, of nuclear weapons, of the role of policy, all of that. Okay? I'm not expecting that I'm going to write that definitive work, and nor is anybody who works for me. Okay? But the goal is to participate in the conversation and make sure that the engineering, the ordnance engineering, the technical part of the story is actually part of some of those projects. That's my soapbox.
Well, so I'm just going to tell you what this team member sounds like. It's a person who is confident but doesn't have a big ego. A person who will ask for help but also troubleshoot. A person who can write efficiently but also dive deep into the research. A person who is able to work with a diverse array of people and take criticism and direction. A person who is good at selling ideas. Maybe has some special skills around having an understanding of the history of science and technology or cultural resource management. Professionals, people from the law school or the business school. Students have particular types of skills. Donors, we like their skills. And people who are able to understand that when they are working for somebody, when you sign on to a team, you become an advocate for whatever it is that team ends up doing. All right? So if partly it's selling an idea about localization of the food system, you can't be the person who's decided that you're secretly negotiating with Walmart, to become their second in command and take over the local food system, right? So, there are a lot of obligations on this. How does anyone actually become this person? How do you get to be that person?
Practice makes perfect. Internships and getting engaged and being in your field and starting in somewhere. I've been in the museum business 37 years now, and so you learn a lot over the time, and you learn a lot about how to transfer ideas and skills. In the museum field, it's somewhat similar to what Rebecca was speaking about. Is you have to think about how do you write something. If you're writing for an exhibition, for example, it's very different than writing a book or an article or an academic paper, which is your opinion and your research. Mm-hmm. You're not doing that when you're writing an exhibitions program script. You are writing an institutional view. And it's a little like what Rebecca was talking about. You have to get inside that and be that. And unlike a book where the human brain links idea to idea and page to page as you read through it, and you remember the storyline in an exhibition, you might walk up to the very center of it and browse it backwards to the other end. And so you have to be able to make the ideas still stand on their own and link them to objects of historic nature. Use the objects to explain the significance of the history. So it's a very different kind of thing, and it takes practice, but those that get into it, I think, really enjoy it.
For me, I would say how you become a person is by being proactive about it, putting yourself out there and pitching your ideas. I mean, I specifically look for people to pitch me story ideas, but I think that from my personal experience, I have a really sort of broad background in a lot of different subject areas, and the way that I've had the most success getting experience is by having an idea, approaching somebody who's more of an expert than I am, saying, I have this idea, I want to work on this project, I have this outline, and putting it out there, because you're not going to get feedback or an invitation to those experiences typically unless you put it forward. So that would be my advice, is to put it out there, because then I think people will be receptive to that. And even if somebody says, I don't want to, that's not a good idea, I don't think that story's going to fly, or this project is ludicrous, at least you have that feedback. At least you know, okay, I need to refine this, and here's why. And so
I just want to respond to that a second and we have everybody sitting over there. There are some chairs over on this side. We can bring more chairs out. We invite you in. We've got a capacity crowd on a closed university day. I'm really happy about that.
There's nothing else to do.
But just thinking about that, I mean, it almost seems as if you have to, on the one hand, really invest in the work you're doing and in the collaborative process, but be divorced enough from it so that your ego isn't bruised if your idea is shot. You know, it's something you risk. You have to be able to risk something but not feel like, you know, they're criticizing your whole life. That sounds like graduate school.
I absolutely agree. I think you just got to put it out there. I mean, and take the time to go around and meet the people in your environment who you don't know now, who might someday put together a task force. If I were here at the University of New Mexico, I'd seek out Virginia, because she forms, as far as I can tell, the most powerful force of nature on the campus. And, is involved in absolutely everything. So even if she's not the one convening the working group or whatever it is, she's going to be consulted about people. So putting it out there with key people who are amazingly available, really. If you just walk in somewhere and say, can I just have 2 minutes, of time, you'll either get it then or you'll get it, next week at 2 p.m. or something like that. So that's what I would say.
Yeah, just building on that, I was thinking about what Bob said last night about being a learner, and I would say, look for a mentor. And then let me flip that around and talk about a little about being a mentor, because I think that there's some responsibility for those of us who are employing people to, once we've got somebody in there, it's similar to being a graduate advisor. I think once you've brought somebody in, invest in them and help them develop the skills that they need to do the job that you're asking them to do. Don't just expect them to get it on their own. So I think that I am a little bit unique among my colleagues in having had an academic career prior to becoming a consultant, and so I have sort of a toolkit for talking to people about writing, which I do often, maybe more often than they want, but I take it upon myself to say to somebody, okay, I see there's some problems with the way you're putting this together on the page. Let's create some kind of opportunity or exercise for you to work on the things I think you need to get to a better place with that aspect of the work that you're called on to do all the time in this job setting.
I would agree, and I would just add that for me, it's about being engaged, and not just having the great passion for the thing that you are specifically interested in trying to sell. That's only plenty of others, but you don't have to have a passion for it to do great work. But you have to be engaged. You have to be engaged both in what you're doing and in whatever we're doing, whatever the activity is, and that's what allows you to turn loose of things when you've been told no, or we're not going to pursue that. But to keep on with whatever the overall enterprise is. And I would, and Bob told us last night, and remind you that we all have to listen, which is very, very difficult when, you know, of course you're the smartest person in the room, right? So it's very difficult to listen to others, but you just have to do it.
So one thing I think we've done over the last couple of days is to kind of de-romanticize collaboration here. You know, so I would ask you, you know, we want people who are good team players, who are good collaborators, who do all these different things. What are the real sticking points, friction points, tension points, points of tearing in any team exercise or any team task?
I think the organizational precepts are really critical. Set it up properly in the start, and then define everybody's roles, and then go forth. I was going to make a comment that, you know, one of the things about the work that we've been talking about is that you're actually creating something, and, you know, in the museum business, it's not always a foregone conclusion that you're actually going to be able to see what you're writing actually come about. It's not like a magazine which is perhaps already going to be published, whether it has your article or someone else's in it. An exhibition can cost $500 a square foot to create. A room this size would cost $750,000 to fill up with proper exhibition materials and objects that are conserved and would be cared for and are lighted properly, and there are some technologies like touchscreens and things to help people learn about what you're writing. It might be that you have to write that whole thing and it gets put on a shelf until the funds come about. So one of the things you want to look for maybe as you're thinking about career paths in some of these is, where's the money? Not for you, but where's the money to see what you want to do get done? Because in some fields, there isn't enough money to see the work that you're going to do get done every time. That still could be very challenging, and it still could be very rewarding. You can still teach people, you can still learn yourself, but it isn't always that you're going to have your name on something every time it happens. It may be that there are other barriers to it.
I think that things get shelved in all different areas. In terms of collaboration, when you asked that question, the very first thing that came to my mind is that as much as you might want it to work sometimes, sometimes you just have personality conflicts that are not going to have any kind of resolution. Like all the forward thinking, all of the good planning and role articulation doesn't mean that everyone is going to be able to work together all of the time. And I think it's really important to recognize those circumstances when they happen and nip them in the bud, you know. Just recognize there are some people that, for whatever reason, I cannot work with them. And hopefully they're not very, you know, those circumstances are not very frequent, but I think I've had a number of projects that are collaborations that get derailed simply because whoever the personalities were couldn't, you know, recognize that circumstance and say, you know what, we have to find different people to take on these roles. So that was the first thing that came to my mind when you asked that question.
I think it's the appropriate, or the chairperson or leader who has the appropriate approach. Something that's firm, willing to damp down any controversies that break out, but short of Stalin. Well, he knew how to run a committee.
A diverse group of people.
Yes, exactly.
And how to disband one, too.
And that's actually a fairly rare art, to find somebody who can do that. I think it has to be somebody who, in the particular milieu that you're operating in, has a certain stature and respect, but also has those skills of being able to tell somebody, it's enough now, let's go on to the next topic, or do the conflict resolution that you have to do.
For me, I think a sticking point of collaboration is doing things in a timely fashion. And if you think about a construction project where you have a contractor and a bunch of subs, if the subs don't come in and out and do the things when they're supposed to, everything goes awry. And I think that's true also when you're collaborating on a project. And it's, in our case, it's not always, you know, my staff who are not getting things done when I want them done, but it's also me turning around things that they need done to proceed. So it happens both at the, you know, at the top and below, that you get bogged down in things not being completed when they ideally should. And since for our work, our deliverables have to go through formatting and production, and there are sometimes other steps that happen at the end of the project that have to be done by support staff, and if I can't get the whole thing together in time for it to go through those steps in, you know, with enough breathing room, then other problems can happen really close to the deadline where things blow up and the deliverable is not ready on time. So that's, yeah, it's all about getting it done on schedule.
I can't emphasize that enough. That like if you can't meet your piece, the deadlines for your piece, or successfully renegotiate them with the other people you're involved with, it just fails. It fails outright, and that's everybody's responsibility. I would say in terms of collaboration, I don't really worry about whether people get along. I myself am academically trained. I have no social skills. It's an engineering lab. They're all academically trained. We're not big on that part of it. But you have to be able, even when you're disagreeing, and even when you really feel that we're failing, and I've all identified who the scapegoat is that we're going to blame for that. That's usually a whole meeting that you have to achieve that. I find it efficient to identify that person up front, because then you don't have to worry about it later when it's all going down in flames. But in order to really get along, there has to be a respect for the skills that are being brought to the table. The reason that it has to be clear in everybody's mind why everybody's there. In other words, what they're all supposed to bring or are going to bring, and then to have respect for those elements, right? You may feel that you write very well and that the proofreader is not really needed. It turns out, you know, the proofreader is really needed and has to be there from the get-go, all of that kind of thing, whatever the roles are. And you have to have respect for that, for those skill sets, and for, even if you don't like those people, for the skills that they bring. And that wherever the failures are, they have to and it's taken me forever. I've been in Sandia for 20 years. It's really taken me forever to get on board with this, and I'm not sure I completely believe it. But that we blame we don't blame the person, right? We look at what the problem is, we try to identify it, we try to, get everybody the training, the skills, whatever they need, so that we really can all pull together. And it's very difficult, because when you have a project that is failing, and you're flailing, that there is a great temptation to start, to get out your pitchforks and torches and take care of the problem. And that's not help, as it turns out. You probably all knew that. It took me a while to learn. So, but I would just say that it really is about that respect, and then you have to ante up and produce your stuff.
Well, the leader has to respect the fact that they're completely dependent on the people that they're leading.
Right.
And they're in the room for a reason. As you say, you respect the skills, you respect that person, you expect them to be able to respect themselves enough to take that criticism and change, what they're doing. So I think that's a big part of it. And I think people shift roles over the course of a project, So some people will take a lead. If it's a big enough project or a big enough organization, they'll take the lead here, but they're probably there. And, you get some meetings that are toxic. Toxic seems to be a word we get, it's sprinkled throughout this. And some meetings that are a rush, even without going to Colorado, right? So some of the meetings just, suddenly you've got this team that really works, and it's super exciting, and everybody leaves, feeling glad that they were there. So that's it's a great moment.
Like I said, it's a great moment. Sometimes you have projects that fail, they get shelved, they get defunded, whatever, things like that, but it still is a great experience. And that's when your teams are really working.
Yeah. Yep. So let me throw it and to all of you people who braved the weather to be here today. Becky.
So a lot of times when graduate students are looking for these jobs, they're not opening up in their immediate area where they have necessarily local contacts. They're opening up in DC, they're opening up in Montana. And what we face is trying to sell the skills that you all want on paper. And so, I mean, if you're looking at a paper resume, how do we convince someone who's in one of your jobs that we have these skills on paper? I mean, because I think sometimes building connections is great, and if you can get into one of your places in New Mexico and have those connections to actually get some face-to-face time, I think it's much easier to sell that you have these skills face-to-face. But I think when you're applying to, the State Museum of Minnesota or in Oregon, they may never get a chance to see you, or you have to get them to want to see you, to meet you. So what would you recommend there?
I learned a lot from did you hear Bob's talk last night? Okay, well, he did a really good job of showing how you take experience and kind of unpack it into skills that are translatable. So you may have had this specific internship or coursework or whatever it is, or job, and figuring out what are the bullet points, the skills that come out of that people should know about, or he was really focusing on the character traits. But I think for me, I was seeing, you could really make a really effective resume that highlights what the value you actually bring to that employer just by writing a better resume. And the other thing is the cover letter, for me, is key. Someone who has taken some time to really figure out what our company does, which is not that easy. We're kind of a weird place for a lot of people. They don't know what history consulting is. So people who take some time to figure it out and aren't just sending me a letter that was kind of repackaged from an application for an academic position, but really think about, this is what you guys do, this is what I feel I bring to that position. That helps me a lot in sorting you out from the pool.
I mean, since you were talking about the museum field, it is one of those things where if you've got a little bit of experience in some museum, it's often what brings your resume up when you're applying for another position in another museum somewhere else. And historians, or people who have historically academic backgrounds, take jobs in all sections. They could be the fundraiser, the public relations manager, they could be a teacher, they could be a curator, which is obvious, they could be the director. They could be, any number of positions, including things like customer service manager. And so I agree that what it is looking at what they're trying to do and then sort of recrafting your own skill interests and showing it so that it would fit within that, and that you have enough sort of thought process around, well, what is this organization trying to do, so that you can get to that first point. And so this is where, getting an internship perhaps in a museum, if that's where you'd like to work, even if you just do something for a summertime and it doesn't have anything to do with where you eventually go. I mean, I started in the museum business as an outreach teacher, teaching art in the coal counties of southern West Virginia, and and then just kept on going. And now I run our nation's nuclear science museum, and I'm a trained landscape artist. Okay, so it's one of those things. You just get in and get going, but you have to craft yourself so that you fit where they're looking for.
And you can do it with sort of linked skills, I think. So as you were talking, I was thinking about, because I work in a museum too. I work at the Autry, and I have for since 2003 on a kind of consulting thing. And the way I kind of got in there was by doing public humanities programs. So, these kind of traveling Chautauqua tent shows on the, Rocky Mountains and Great Plains. So I had, experience. They knew I had experience talking to the public. I'd done little tiny exhibitions in grad school, but it was just like, this is somebody, and the first time that they invited me to do a consulting gig for them, This was hilarious, actually. I get this phone call when I was an assistant professor here. I know I wasn't going to talk, but I have to tell this story. So I get this phone call, and it's this woman who's like, "Hi, my name is Patricia Trenton. Do you know her by any chance?" She's a curator in LA. And she said, "I'm doing this exhibition on women artists for the Autry Museum." And I said, "Well, you know, I don't really know anything about women artists." And she said, "But, well, you're a historian, aren't you? You know how to look things up." And I said, "Well, you know, yeah, I'm pretty good at looking things up." And then she said, "Well, we want somebody to write an introduction to a catalog that we're doing for an exhibition on women artists and the painters in the American West, 1890 to 1945. And I said, "Well, you know, I got to get my tenure book done, and I'm, you know, kind of nervous about all that stuff." And she said, "Oh, well, you know, we would pay you very well." And I said, "Well, you'd have to pay me really, really well, you know, because you know." So now I'm starting to feel arrogant, right? You know, "You would have to pay me," and I named a figure, you know, thinking it would be way out of their range. And she said, "Oh, we're going to pay you more than twice that much. But if you want us to pay you that other amount, we could do that." I said, "No, I can go with what you've got." But then, you know, so I said, "Well, you know, how did you find me?" And she said, "Well, actually, you weren't our first choice." And they told me about this very eminent scholar in Western women's history, and they said, "Well, you know, we called her first. And we asked her if she wanted to do it, and she said, "Well, the Autry Museums, no, that's not what I do. You know," so she was outside of the mission in the sense, you know, "I wouldn't do that. That's not my mission." You know, she says, and they said, "Well, can you recommend somebody?" Pat Trenton said to her. She said, "Well, what do you want? You want a real scholar or a popularizer?" And Pat Trenton said, "We'll take the popularizer." And she said, "You should call Scharff." You know? So, and I just thought, you know, okay, I can live with that. You know? And the rest, as they say, is, you know, museums or whatever. But, you know, so being available for that opportunity and not being insulted if somebody tells you they think you can talk to people. And, you know.
Well, and a lot of it is that you never know what they're going to ask you to do, too. I mean, here we have a nuclear science museum. We're writing a script for about play in the atomic age. We got the largest collection of Lionel trains that are atomic themed in the country. It's like 165 Lionel train cars and engines. And they're all atomic themed. They're from the Cold War era, you know, and somebody had collected all these things and gave them to us. And so now we're writing a script about what was it like to be a little boy or a little girl and examining the Cold War from the standpoint of I'm playing with toys while I'm freaking out. You know, the government has this mad that's going to wipe us off the face of the earth. Well, you know, I don't know that. Well, okay, so you get to write about things that you wouldn't consider. You wouldn't necessarily think, well, maybe at that place they only write about nuclear power generation or nuclear weapons in the Cold War. No, you write about all kinds of things. You develop things by looking at the objects and building the storylines around them and teasing out the important attributes, and some of them are really kind of subtle. Chemistry sets that had nuclear material in them. You know, that stuff
That's
was
subtle.
yeah, that stuff was dangerous. And yet, you know, you could get those for your little boy or girl in 1950. They weren't cheap, but they were there. Now they go for like $9,000 on eBay. Just a box, you know. I mean, so. Yeah, you know, I mean, well, we were trying to get one of those for years and years, and they're very rare. And then all of a sudden, a fellow from Santa Fe who collected some of that stuff brought in a collection, and don't you know, there were 3 of them.
Wow.
Now we have more than any other museum of these kinds of things. And this is the clash of the titans, okay? So this was a company called Gilbert, and they ran the Gilbert Hall of Science in New York City. They were the preeminent first teachers of science to people that were on the street. Before the Exploratorium, which you probably know of in San Francisco, you know the Exploratorium's connection to Albuquerque and to New Mexico? Who was the first director of the Exploratorium? Frank Oppenheimer, Jay Roberts' brother. Yes, so they invented interactive science teaching. Anyway, the clash of the titans was that Gilbert bought the company that made these science kits. And then Lionel bought Porter Chem Lab. And they made another one. And so these two, this was after toy trains, and what are the kids going to play with before slot cars? Well, they're going to play with chemistry sets. Well, now we got nuclear ones. All right, you know.
This is STEM research.
It is. Yes.
I'm starting to feel like a Chernobyl survivor. But, to me, one of the key elements of the story you just told was the phone call. And I think any time you could make one-to-one personal contact with somebody there on any premise whatsoever, either through a mutual friend or just picking up the phone and calling them and saying, I'm trying to figure out if maybe this is something I ought to apply for. Can you put me through to somebody who can give me an idea what the program's like? That sort of thing is, you think about when people apply for really big grants, the first thing they do is march off to New York and meet the officer who is in charge of that grant department. Actually, what they do is they call, they get the appointment, say, I'm going to be in New York for 3 days. Could I meet with you? And he says, or she says, yes. And then you go back and buy the airplane ticket to get there.
Right.
Could I ask, in fact, for you to expand, and this is partly building on what Becky asked too, about like building these kinds of professional networks, starting from our point of view as being graduate students. What are some of the ways that you would suggest that we actually go about growing these networks outside of our traditional kind of university academic core?
Please, I'll take that. Certainly go to conferences. While you're there, take a look around that town or city, see who else you might want to meet. Actually target a particular individual that you want to cozy up to and get to know. And try and set an appointment, just to pick their brain for a few minutes, not asking anything particular of them. But there's some people who seem incredibly good at this and who just seek out journalists and, heads of companies and board members and so on. And I think they do it mainly by just, starting this process pretty aggressively and reaching out to folks like that who could be available.
I would reiterate that, and if there are people who are doing work that you find interesting, engage them, ask them questions. That's how you build those networks, because ultimately they're going to become an acquaintance and then a friend, and then you'll get a phone call. And I wanted to say one other thing about resumes. I think that while it's important to not have too much minutia, I think having a few things that are unique and that are sort of outside of whatever your specific field can be really valuable, because it shows that you have skills beyond whatever your narrow focus is. And oftentimes that will be the thing that catches somebody's eye. If you mostly have been in academia and are a teacher and have researched these topics, but then you volunteer at the hospital and there's a clear connection between those things somehow, that can be a thing that sort of puts you just above some of the other folks. And then, I'm sure that everybody's been to a million resume writing workshops, but send it to people who maybe are not in that particular field for feedback. And, because if you're sending it someplace that has an HR department, for example, your language may be really specific to whoever it needs to get to ultimately, but if it's being looked at by somebody who is not a professional in that area, they might look at it and be like, I don't know, So, have people read it who are not your colleagues in that area, and just get feedback from them about what they understand and what they don't understand, because at least for me, that has been really valuable.
And I would say generally avoid personnel departments.
Yes. Well, it's really important to do that, because if you're not, you're just trying to get connected. You're not applying for a job yet. So try to stay away from the personnel departments. Try to make a one-on-one connection. If you do, call them up, make an appointment, keep the business card, write a personal thank you note. This is critical. you want to be remembered as the person who took the time to do that. Because so many times I have had somebody just call on us and walk in and want to talk, and they've enjoyed our place. Oh, I'd just like to meet the director. Well, I'm always into that, because you never know, for one thing, I'm a nonprofit, who's going to write you the check? So you go up and say hello, thank them. And if they send you a thank you note, the next time you're thinking, you know, we're going to get this grant, and we're going to do this thing, and there was a guy who came here, and I bet you that person would be interested in this. I think I've got the card, or I think I got the thank you note. That's how you make connections, because you may not even get the position posted, where you make the connection for someone who might be perfect for it.
I think the other thing is not to, nothing is beneath you, right? Like when you're thinking about going to another, you're going to go to a conference, there's a local museum, the director's not available because he's at some other conference, whatever, go in and talk to whomever, if you're interested in museum work, right? Just make it the point, because there's all those gaps in the conference, that you can go and do that. And realize that whoever's there, it's not beneath you to talk to them, all right? And that's true of, that's true throughout life in many ways, but really when you're thinking about connections, you don't know who's going to be making that phone call later, or who's going to mention you to the director or whatever.
And a lot of us came through this already, we were where you are at one point, and people helped us. So we're committed, I think, in a lot of ways to taking the time to go out and say hello, or to, speak with someone. We're not too busy. We like to be asked. So you got to ask.
This is probably obvious, but take advantage of your professors' networks and ask them if they know somebody at the institution or the company or whatever, and to help open the door for you. The other thing is put the word out that it doesn't, you may be focused on a specific institution or type of job, but put the word out that you're looking for jobs, and you never know what phone call you might get. My first job out of college, I actually had asked for some advice from the father of a classmate of mine who was in the field that he was practicing law in the area that I was looking for a job, not as a lawyer, but I wanted to work for a law firm that represented tribes. And I wanted to be in New Mexico or Arizona. And he was in DC, and I said, can you tell me which law firms there are out there that I could apply to? And he did, and I sent letters and resumes to all of them, and nothing came of that. But then a couple months later, he called me and said, you know what, we could really use a historian here to help us with a case we have going on. So that's how I got the job.
And then before you're off the topic, would you mind maybe making any comments about like the role of current social media in any of this? I mean, there are like 1,000 different social media network sites, and we're kind of told to be part of all of it, but that is a ridiculous time requirement that's not actually necessarily helpful. So
I have a specific comment about that. One, I would say have a website for yourself. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It can just be like a single page, but have a place where people can find information about you. And then my rule of thumb with social media is you can't engage with it all and be effective. So pick one, maybe two that you really enjoy, and that sort of it's meaningful for you to engage with it, and use those tools and use them well.
But be careful too.
Right.
Well, and use them, I would say, and use them as a, if you're gonna use them as a professional tool, use them as a professional tool. Don't use them as a personal and social tool. And
the millennials do that less. It's all okay.
what less?
Mix the personal and the business in social media, or for the New York Times.
Well, it's hard sometimes, and people, are looking at those for applicants. And if you find someone who seems really great on paper, and they're really interesting, but they are just nuts on super media. I mean, their social media is all anti-something, or they're just, it just seems like they're two different people. That just, that doesn't work out well.
And it can be even less extreme than that. For the work I do, if you have a really strong political ideology or agenda, that's great, but if it enters into how you analyze history, it's not gonna work well for the work that we do. So if somehow I see that, frankly, I don't really see any social media when I'm looking at job candidates. It doesn't matter to me. But if I were to see something like that where I thought this candidate has a strong political agenda that might make it hard to have the neutrality that you need for the work that we do, I think I'd be a little put off by that.
Just say something about the social media. And that is, what I keep hearing is pick up the phone and call. All right, and let me just say, as a chair, right, where I get probably 100 emails a day, all of my colleagues will now tell you if I want to talk to somebody about something, I actually walk upstairs and say hi and spend 1 or 2 minutes having a conversation or pick up the phone. It is way more effective. So I think I have one Twitter line that says phone call, phone call, phone call. Right? I mean, so I know everybody gets used to the email, right? But it is hard to differentiate between, somebody who's serious and somebody who's just, tossing something out there. There's still nothing like a personal contact.
Yeah, and I would just add to that realize that if you are contacting via email, and I've had, requests for, usually just information requests, not for jobs, but it's very easy for it to, once it falls off, it shows on my screen, right? That the odds of my answering it drop. And so if you need something and you haven't heard from me, call me. Okay, and I mean, my information's on our external website, and that's what you have no need of me, but I mean, just in general, realize that there's a balance between persistence and pest, but you should be persistent. The fact that you haven't heard back doesn't mean that somebody made a decision other than they're answering some other email. So, just go ahead and follow up.
I have to say, I'm one of the few people that would prefer to have an email to a phone call. And, but not a long one, right? I had a mentor in grad school who used to have his office hours, and you'd go to his door and he'd say, come on in, but don't stay long. And that's sort of how I feel about email. Write me an email. I will answer it as quickly as I possibly can, but don't write me an email that's more than one screen long.
And say what you want at the first. The first sentence is, what do you need from me? And then if you need to give me 4 pages of background, I can debate it, but just say.
Put it on as an attachment if you need to.
Right,
Pay attention to the subject line.
Yeah.
Because too many times it's just read this, put a subject line that someone will know. Oh,
Where
yeah.
if you have 30,000 emails in your inbox, you can sort it by the subject line and find the email.
Can I offer a suggestion? This is for networking, if you're using email to do it. If you've gotten the name of somebody you should talk to from your advisor or somebody else that's what you should put in your subject line. Steve Aaron told me to contact you. Because if that is a friend of theirs, they're gonna look at it at least to see who is this person and why did Steve send them money.
And I would suggest you always use Steve's name.
Or Barack Obama.
You had a question, Paul?
Before we change subject, and I just say one other thing. We live in a time where our communication strategies are really changing. And so, I think that understanding the demographics of wherever you're applying to or trying to network with is important also. If it's a company that the demographic is very young, they're going to want to see that you know how to effectively engage in social media, because that's going to be more what their communication strategy is. They're going to want to know that you know how to update a WordPress site. But if you're working for a company whose demographics are older, they're going to want to know that you're as comfortable doing that as you are writing a letter and printing it and putting it in an envelope and sending it in the mail. So I think understanding the demographic differences and being able to engage with the communication that makes the most sense in that arena and being flexible that way, because you are going to have to work with people who are a lot older than you, and you're going to have to work with people who are younger than you, and sort of being able to be a bridge with a lot of different communication tools is going to be really critical.
Yes.
I recruit students from the University of New Mexico for the city of Albuquerque. And the way that we get the word out that there's a job opening is typically through email blasts for different departments, or even ads in the Lobo, in the Daily Lobo. And we usually ask for a letter of interest, a resume, and a writing sample, always a writing sample. And it's curious that in some departments, especially in history, the CV is used as opposed to the resume. And I'll tell you that most people working in business or in government don't respond very well to a CV. They respond well to a resume, and it's got to be unique. Every one of those resumes should be unique for the job you're applying for. Every cover letter has to be unique in its construction and its substance. And the writing sample should be not that long. It can even be an excerpt, an introduction. It can be an essay. It can be a business letter. But it's got to be powerful, and it has to impress. And I'll tell you, the way that the top two or the top three are called for interviews has to do with typically with the letter of interest. It's very, very important. So you can make an impression long distance if you use the resume, the letter of interest, and your writing sample very well to catch attention. After that, then it's personal interview, and then it's going to be how well you do in charming people across a table. So I just wanted to make sure that the students here understand how important it is not to make a mistake in the cover letter, and then you immediately get thrown out. Just dropping an E, similar or something similar to that, and you're out.
And that is absolutely no different from applying for an academic job. So I had a conversation with Ari Kelman and Lance Blythe yesterday where we all admitted that if we're sitting on a search committee and there is a passive sentence in the first paragraph of the cover letter, you're done. We'll throw it out. Word to the wise. Speaking of charming people, at first glance, I think we're going to thank the panelists very much for a very, very